The weight of power. Harold Jones' life looked perfect from the outside. He was the CEO of one of the city's most reputable firms, a man who wielded influence and authority, making decisions that rippled throughout the company and beyond. To the world, he was a symbol of success, a man who had climbed the corporate ladder with a ruthlessness that many feared but also respected. In truth, Harold's journey to the top had been anything but easy. The years of struggle, late nights, and sacrifices were burned into his memory, reminding him why he deserved his position and why he'd never let anything jeopardize it. It was early morning, and the office was quiet as Harold strolled in, his presence instantly felt by everyone within earshot. The click of his polished black shoes against the tile floor was like a warning bell for the employees, signaling that they needed to be on their best behavior. Harold wasn't known for patience, especially when he was stressed. His face, with its stern expression and deeply furrowed brows, reflected the immense pressure he was under. Today's meeting with the investors had been looming over him like a dark cloud for weeks. Everything he'd worked for could crumble if he didn't make an impeccable impression. The weight of the day pressed heavily on him as he walked past rows of cubicles. His gaze darted briefly to a young intern fumbling with a stack of papers near the photocopier. Harold's eyes narrowed. He'd hired him to be efficient, not clumsy. In a sharp tone, he barked, "Wilson, I expect those reports on my desk in 10 minutes. No excuses." The intern, clearly rattled, nodded frantically, nearly dropping the pile of papers in his haste. Satisfied but unimpressed, Harold didn't bother giving him another glance. He had no time for incompetence, not today of all days. When he finally reached his office, his assistant, Nida, was waiting for him with a freshly brewed cup of coffee and his meticulously typed itinerary. "Your schedule for the day, Mr. Jones," she said, handing him both items with the calm efficiency Harold had come to rely on. Nida was one of the few people Harold trusted implicitly, and though he rarely showed it, he valued her loyalty. "Thank you, Nida," Harold muttered, taking a quick sip of the coffee. The warmth spread through him, grounding him, if only for a moment. He needed this brief respite before plunging into the maelstrom that awaited him. "Make sure no one disturbs me for the next hour," he ordered as he sat down, his eyes already scanning the agenda. "I need to review my presentation." Nida nodded without a word, her quiet footsteps fading as she left the room and gently closed the door behind her. Harold appreciated her understanding of his need for solitude before high-stakes moments. Taking a deep breath, he sank into his plush leather chair and opened his laptop. The glow from the screen illuminated his face, casting shadows that accentuated the deep lines etched by years of intense responsibility and sleepless nights. Harold's fingers scrolled through the presentation slides he had spent countless hours preparing. Each slide represented a part of his vision, his calculated plan to propel the company into a new era of success. But as he reviewed his notes, a nagging doubt gnawed at him. Was this enough? Would the investors see the potential that he saw? The mere thought of failure made his stomach tighten, and for a fleeting moment, his confident facade cracked. He couldn't afford to let doubt seep in, not now. Outside, the usual hum of the office was noticeably quieter. His employees, sensing his tense mood, worked in hushed tones, glancing at the closed door with a mixture of apprehension and respect. They understood the stakes today, too. Many of them knew that their jobs were contingent on the company's performance, and this meeting could shape their futures as much as it would his own. Taking another gulp of coffee, Harold tried to shake off his worries. This wasn't the time for weakness. He loosened his tie, feeling a pang of claustrophobia. His office, though spacious and adorned with modern decor, suddenly felt stifling. The weight of his responsibilities seemed to compress the very air around him. Standing up, he walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the city skyline. From his vantage point on the 23rd floor, the world seemed small, almost insignificant. Buildings stretched into the distance, their glass exteriors gleaming in the early morning light. Cars below crawled like ants, oblivious to the struggles of the people who occupy them. He had always found comfort in this view. It reminded him of his achievements, of how far he had come from his humble beginnings. Yet today, even this familiar sight offered little solace. As he gazed out, Harold's mind wandered back to his past, to the days when he was just a young man struggling to make a name for himself in a ruthless industry. He had worked tirelessly, sacrificing friendships, relationships, and even his health to get where he was. Failure had never been an option for him. He had clawed his way up, one grueling step at a time, and now, at the pinnacle of his career, he couldn't bear the thought of watching it all fall apart. He turned away from the window, a steely determination hardening his resolve. This was his moment, his chance to secure his legacy. Harold was willing to do whatever it took to ensure the meeting was a success, even if it meant stepping on a few people along the way. Just as he was about to sit back down, his attention was caught by a faint sound outside his office. The quiet shuffle of footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. Harold's irritation flared. Hadn't he explicitly told Nita to keep everyone away? The last thing he needed was an interruption when he was trying to focus. Curiosity, and a bit of anger, propelled him to the door. He opened it just a crack, intending to reprimand whoever dared to disturb his concentration. But as he looked out, he paused, his scowl deepening at the sight before him. An elderly janitor, clad in a faded blue uniform and holding a mop, was carefully cleaning the hallway floor. His movements were slow, deliberate, and utterly oblivious to the fact that he was treading in a space Harold had demanded be kept silent and undisturbed. The man's dark skin contrasted starkly with his gray hair, which peeked out from under his cap. His face was lined with age and experience, but there was a calm dignity in his posture, a steadiness that spoke of years spent in service. For a moment, Harold simply watched, feeling a spark of annoyance. Who allowed this man to work here, in the high-end corporate offices where clients and investors might roam? And why was he here, now, at this critical moment? In Harold's mind, the janitor's presence was an affront to the professional environment he had painstakingly cultivated. "Hey!" Harold's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence of the corridor. The janitor looked up, his expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Harold demanded, his tone laced with condescension. "This is a professional workspace, not a—" He hesitated, searching for the words that would convey his disdain without straying too far into the offensive. The janitor met his gaze calmly, unfazed by Harold's harsh tone. There was a softness in his eyes, a patience that seemed almost out of place in the face of Harold's scorn. He continued to hold the mop, his hand steady despite the tremor that occasionally rippled through his aged fingers. "My apologies, sir," the janitor replied, his voice low but steady. "I was just finishing up here. I'll be out of your way in a moment." The man's calmness only served to deepen Harold's irritation. To him, it felt like an act of defiance, as if the janitor wasn't taking his authority seriously. Harold's voice grew colder. "See that you are," he snapped, not bothering to hide his disdain. "I don't need any distractions today, especially not from, well, never mind." The janitor nodded, his gaze flickering for a moment before he resumed his work, moving the mop slowly across the floor. Harold turned on his heel and returned to his office, slamming the door behind him. But even as he sat back down, trying to refocus on his presentation, he couldn't shake the irritation that lingered. A seed of humility. Back in his office, Harold settled into his chair, fuming. The audacity of that janitor lingered in his mind, disrupting the focus he desperately needed. Who was he to look so indifferent, so unfazed? Harold was accustomed to the quick obedience of his subordinates, the immediate apologies and hasty apologies whenever he scolded them. But this man, this elderly janitor, seemed unaffected by Harold's rebuke, his calmness acting as a mirror to Harold's own agitation. Taking a deep breath, Harold tried to brush it off. After all, what did it matter? The janitor was gone, and Harold had more pressing matters to attend to. He opened his laptop again and began scrolling through his slides, determined to make up for the few precious minutes he had lost. Yet, as he reviewed his notes, his mind kept wandering back to that brief interaction. The truth was, Harold couldn't understand people like the janitor. To him, life had always been a race, a relentless push for more. More power, more influence, more success. He believed people either rose to the top or settled for whatever meager life they could scrape together. To his mind, complacency was a weakness, a lack of ambition that he couldn't fathom or respect. He had little patience for those who were content with menial jobs, who seemed indifferent to the struggle for advancement. Yet there was something about the janitor's steady gaze, his quiet dignity, that unsettled Harold. It was as if the man had a secret, some quiet knowledge that Harold couldn't access. The shrill ring of his phone jolted him out of his thoughts. He reached over and answered, masking his irritation with a forced calm. "Harold Jones," he said briskly. "Harold, it's Nida. I just wanted to let you know the investors will be arriving a bit earlier than expected," she informed him, her voice calm but cautious. "Of course they are," Harold muttered, rolling his eyes. "How much time do I have?" "About 30 minutes, maybe less," she replied. "Understood. Make sure the boardroom is set up and that there are refreshments. I want everything to look flawless." "Already taken care of," Nida responded. "Is there anything else you need?" "No, that will be all," Harold replied curtly before hanging up. 30 minutes. That was hardly enough time to calm his mind and refocus. Shoving the janitor from his thoughts, he ran through his speech in his mind, preparing to impress the investors with every ounce of charisma and authority he had cultivated over the years. This meeting had the potential to open new doors, expanding the company's reach, strengthening its foundations. And in the back of his mind, Harold knew it also meant more for him, more prestige, more recognition. He took another sip of coffee, then another, his mind racing with strategies. But as he poured himself into his work, a soft knock sounded on his door, so faint it was almost unnoticeable. Harold clenched his jaw, his irritation flaring up again. Who would dare disturb him after his specific instructions? He ignored it, hoping they'd leave, but the knock came again, just as soft, yet persistent. Finally, he stormed to the door and flung it open, prepared to give whoever was there a piece of his mind. To his surprise, it was the janitor again, his mop and cleaning supplies now tucked away in a cart. The man held a small folded piece of paper in his hand, which he offered to Harold with a nod. "What is this?" Harold asked, his voice laced with impatience. "Just a small message, sir," the janitor replied, his voice as calm as it had been in the hallway. "I thought you might like to read it." Harold snatched the paper, barely glancing at the janitor before turning back into his office and shutting the door. He unfolded the note, expecting it to be something trivial, maybe a suggestion for the cleaning schedule or a formal apology. Instead, the note read, "Sometimes we find the most important lessons not in the places we expect, but in the places we least want to look. Remember, true strength comes not from authority, but from kindness. Respect is earned, not demanded." Harold stared at the words, feeling a strange mixture of annoyance and curiosity. What on earth was this supposed to mean? And who did this man think he was, giving him advice on strength and respect? Harold was the CEO of this company. He was the one in charge. He was the one people respected, or at least feared. The very notion of taking a lesson from a janitor was preposterous. And yet, for some reason, the words lingered in his mind, leaving a subtle sting he couldn't quite shake. He crumpled the note in his fist, tossing it into the wastebasket with a scoff. He didn't need life lessons from a man who probably made less in a year than Harold spent on a single vacation. He pushed the incident aside, focusing once more on his notes, on the vision he was ready to sell to the investors. But his focus was fractured, the janitor's calm gaze and simple words echoing in the back of his mind, like a stubborn refrain. Minutes later, another knock came at his door. This time, Harold was ready to explode, but he composed himself just enough before answering. When he opened it, Nida was there, clipboard in hand, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Jones, the investors are here," she said softly, sensing his agitation. "Good," Harold replied, exhaling sharply. "Show them to the boardroom. I'll be there shortly." Nida nodded and left, and Harold took a moment to straighten his suit, his reflection in the glass partition revealing the hint of tension etched on his face. He forced a smile, reminding himself of the confidence he exuded so naturally when he needed to. But even as he straightened his tie and smoothed his jacket, he felt an unfamiliar unease. He pushed it down, reminding himself that he was Harold Jones, a man who had conquered every challenge he'd ever faced. When he finally entered the boardroom, the investors were already seated, their polished suits and poised expressions mirroring the cutthroat energy Harold himself exuded. He shook hands with each one, his smile professional, his demeanor radiating confidence. As they settled into their seats, he launched into his presentation, his words smooth and compelling as he painted a vision of the company's future, weaving in data, projections, and strategies. Yet even as he spoke, he felt a slight distance from his own words. Normally, he was fully immersed in the power of his pitch, the drive to impress, to control every reaction in the room. But today, he felt off-kilter, distracted by the note's words still gnawing at him from the recesses of his mind. And that's why I believe this new direction will not only secure our current position in the market, but also pave the way for unprecedented growth in the coming years. Harold concluded, his voice as strong as ever. The investors nodded, some exchanging glances, seemingly impressed. The room was silent for a moment, and Harold felt a surge of relief. The worst part was over, or so he thought. Then one of the senior investors, a woman with an air of authority that rivaled his own, leaned forward. "Mr. Jones, I appreciate the clarity of your presentation. However, I'm curious about one thing. How do you intend to foster the kind of workplace culture that will support such ambitious growth?" Harold was caught off guard. Culture? His presentations usually revolved around numbers, forecasts, and competitive advantages. The internal dynamics of the company were rarely, if ever, the focus of investor discussions. "Of course," he replied, masking his surprise with a practiced smile. "We prioritize efficiency and discipline among our teams. I believe in setting high standards, and I expect my employees to rise to meet them." The investor nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. "High standards are important, no doubt. But I wonder, do your employees feel supported? Do they feel valued in this pursuit of success? We've seen too many companies flounder because they fail to build a culture that inspires loyalty and commitment." Harold hesitated, momentarily at a loss. The idea of inspiring loyalty felt almost foreign to him. He believed loyalty was earned through respect for authority, not necessarily kindness or encouragement. But as he looked around the table, he noticed a few other investors nodding, clearly valuing her perspective. He forced another smile. "I understand your concern," he said smoothly. "I can assure you that I take every measure to ensure the well-being of my team. They know the expectations, and they're well compensated for meeting them." The investors exchanged glances, some nodding, others still contemplating. As the meeting continued, Harold couldn't shake the nagging feeling of unease. The janitor's words echoed in his mind once again. Respect is earned, not demanded. After the meeting concluded, the investors filed out, some offering polite but non-committal feedback. Harold shook their hands, his face a mask of confidence, but inside, he felt an unfamiliar discomfort. He couldn't deny that the investors' questions had shaken him, forcing him to confront aspects of his leadership that he'd long ignored. As he returned to his office, Harold glanced at the wastebasket, where the crumpled note still lay. For reasons he couldn't explain, he reached down, picked it up, and smoothed it out, reading the words again. They struck him even more deeply now, a quiet reminder that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a strength he'd overlooked. a strength rooted not in authority but in humility, a reflection unseen. After the investors departed, the office buzzed with a sense of anticipation as employees awaited feedback on the meeting. Harold, however, remained cloistered in his office, staring blankly at his laptop, his mind adrift. The investor's unexpected question about culture and loyalty reverberated in his head like an echo that refused to fade. Normally, he would have been reviewing the meeting with a critical eye, strategizing his next moves, and relishing any hint of approval from the investors. But today, his mind was cluttered with thoughts he didn't quite understand, tangled with the notion of respect and the janitor's note. Harold sighed, rubbing his temples. He was unused to feeling uncertain. Confidence had always been his armor, and he wore it as naturally as he wore his tailored suits. But as he read the words again on the crumpled note, he felt something unexpected: doubt. It was a feeling he hadn't entertained in years, and it made him uncomfortable, even vulnerable. Sinking into his leather chair, he tried to shake the unease by reviewing the numbers from his presentation, hoping that the familiar terrain of data would ground him. But each time he started to focus, his mind slipped back to the hallway, to the janitor's calm, unruffled gaze, and to the investor's piercing question. Harold glanced at the time. It was just after midday, and a lunch meeting with a client awaited him. He didn't particularly feel like going but couldn't afford to reschedule. Appearances had to be maintained. He adjusted his tie, smoothing out his suit, and headed for the elevator. As he passed through the hallway, he half expected to see the janitor again, almost looking forward to confronting him with some biting remark. But the hallway was empty. He felt a strange pang of disappointment as he entered the elevator. Shaking it off, he turned his thoughts toward the lunch meeting, mentally rehearsing the usual pleasantries. His conversation was sharp, confident, and persuasive, and as he spoke, he almost convinced himself that the morning's events hadn't affected him. But as the meal ended and he returned to his office, the unease settled back into his mind like an unwelcome guest. Back in his office, Harold decided he needed answers, and the only way to find them was to confront the man who had disrupted his entire day. He paged Nida. "Yes, Mr. Jones." Her calm voice came over the intercom. "Nida, I need you to find out about the janitor. What's his name? How long has he worked here? And find out if he's scheduled to be here this afternoon," Harold instructed, keeping his tone casual. There was a slight pause before Nida answered. "Of course, Mr. Jones. I'll look into it and get back to you." He leaned back, staring out the window at the skyline, trying to piece together why he was so affected. It felt absurd to be distracted by a brief interaction with a janitor, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something he was missing. Nida returned shortly, standing in the doorway with her clipboard. "I looked into it, Mr. Jones," she said. "The janitor's name is Benjamin Carter. He's been with the company for nearly 2 decades, long before you took over as CEO." Harold raised an eyebrow. 2 decades. He's been here that long? "Yes," Nida replied, her tone calm, but carrying a hint of respect. "He's well liked by the staff and known for his punctuality and kindness. And yes, he'll be working this afternoon." "Thank you, Nida," Harold said, dismissing her with a slight nod. He pondered the information, surprised by the realization that he'd never known anything about the man. 2 decades. Benjamin had been a fixture in the company far longer than Harold himself, yet Harold had never taken a moment to acknowledge him, let alone learn his name. Determined to satisfy his curiosity, Harold decided he would wait for an opportunity to speak with Benjamin privately. As the afternoon wore on, Harold found himself glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes until the day wound to a close and most of the staff had left. Around 6 in the evening, the office began to empty, and the usual bustle faded into quiet. At last, he stepped out of his office, walking through the now empty hallways, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he rounded a corner, he spotted Benjamin near the break room, methodically wiping down a table. The janitor hadn't noticed Harold's approach. His posture relaxed, his movements slow but deliberate. "Benjamin," Harold said, his voice echoing in the quiet space. Benjamin looked up, his expression calm, as if he'd been expecting Harold all along. "Mr. Jones," he greeted him with a respectful nod, pausing in his work. Harold hesitated, momentarily thrown off by the man's composed demeanor. "I wanted to ask you about the note you left," he began, feeling oddly self-conscious. "Why did you write it?" Benjamin studied him for a moment before responding. "Sometimes, Mr. Jones, people need reminders about what truly matters. Not everyone sees it right away." Harold felt a flash of irritation. "What makes you think I need a reminder? I've built this company up through hard work and dedication. I've made sacrifices, and I'm successful because I don't waste time on trivialities." Benjamin listened without interruption, nodding slowly as if considering Harold's words. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle yet firm. "Success is important, Mr. Jones, but there are things it can't buy. It doesn't buy respect, and it certainly doesn't buy happiness." The words stung more than Harold cared to admit. "And what would you know about success or happiness?" He shot back, his tone sharper than he'd intended. Benjamin's expression didn't waver. "I may not be a CEO, but I know the value of a life well lived. I know what it means to be respected, not for a title, but for the way I treat others. I've seen people come and go in this company, people with titles and influence, but few of them left a mark on the people around them." Harold felt an uncomfortable twist in his gut. He had always considered himself a man who left an impression, but in the context of Benjamin's words, he began to question what kind of impression that truly was. "What are you trying to say?" Harold asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with a vulnerability he hadn't intended to reveal. Benjamin's gaze softened. "I'm saying that maybe it's time to look beyond the numbers and the power, Mr. Jones. You've built something impressive, but at what cost? Have you taken the time to understand the people who work for you, to know their names, their struggles?" Harold's mind flashed back to the investor's question about loyalty and culture. He had always assumed that the perks, the salaries, and the prestige were enough to secure loyalty. But here was Benjamin, a man who had no authority, no high salary, yet held the respect of those around him because of his quiet kindness and humility. Harold felt the weight of his own ignorance pressing down on him, an uncomfortable realization settling over him. "Why have you stayed here so long, Benjamin?" Harold asked, genuinely curious. "Surely you could have moved on to something else." Benjamin smiled, his gaze drifting to the empty office space. "This place has been more than a job for me. It's been a community, a place where I've built friendships and helped others, even if my work often goes unnoticed. And yes, I could have left, but sometimes the value of a place isn't in the paycheck. It's in the connections you make." Harold looked away, feeling a pang of guilt. He couldn't remember the last time he viewed the office as anything more than a place to assert his authority and grow his influence. He realized he treated it more like a battlefield than a community, a place to conquer rather than nurture. After a long silence, Harold spoke again. "I don't know if I could ever see things that way," he admitted, his voice subdued. "For years, I've fought to get to where I am. I've sacrificed so much to prove myself." Benjamin nodded, his expression understanding. "There's nothing wrong with ambition, Mr. Jones, but it's easy to lose sight of why you started in the first place. Sometimes, ambition becomes a mask for fear." Harold's brows furrowed. "Fear? What fear?" Benjamin regarded him kindly, his eyes filled with a depth of understanding. "The fear of failure, of being seen as weak or insignificant. The fear that if you stop pushing, you might be left behind. But true strength comes from knowing yourself, from being willing to pause and understand the people around you, to earn their trust and respect, not just their obedience." The words hit Harold harder than he expected. He realized he had been living in a constant state of guardedness, driven by the fear of losing control, of letting someone see his vulnerability. His achievements had become armor, a shield against the very things that could actually make him a stronger, more respected leader. "Thank you, Benjamin," Harold said quietly, feeling a mix of humility and gratitude he hadn't felt in years. Benjamin nodded, giving him a small smile. "You're welcome, Mr. Jones. Remember, the measure of a man isn't in his titles or his wealth, but in his character." Harold watched as Benjamin returned to his work, moving down the hallway with the same calm demeanor. For the first time, Harold felt he had learned something important, not from a CEO, a mentor, or a corporate handbook, but from a man who had spent decades quietly serving without seeking recognition. Back in his office, Harold sank into his chair, replaying the conversation in his mind. The janitor's words lingered, sinking into places Harold hadn't explored in years. The world beyond his office walls suddenly felt more vivid, filled with people he had barely acknowledged. And for the first time in a long while, Harold felt a genuine desire not to lead with fear, but to understand, to connect, and to maybe, just maybe, become the kind of leader who inspired loyalty not through power, but through respect. The cracks began to show. The next morning, Harold arrived at the office unusually early. The sunrise cast a warm, golden light over the city, illuminating the tall glass buildings and bustling streets below. But Harold barely noticed. He felt a tension he couldn't quite place, a gnawing sense that something fundamental had shifted within him. He wasn't sure if it was change or discomfort, but it gripped him, pushing him into a rare introspective state. He settled into his office, staring at the towering stack of papers on his desk. Normally, he would have jumped right into work, sifting through reports, signing off on decisions, issuing orders to keep the machine of his company moving. But today, he sat there, his mind wandering back to his conversation with Benjamin. The janitor's calm, wise words had burrowed deep, opening a door Harold had locked away long ago. He couldn't help but wonder how many people like Benjamin worked in his building, whose lives and stories he dismissed or ignored simply because they didn't hold titles or wield power. After a few moments, he picked up the phone and dialed Nida's extension. "Yes, Mr. Jones," came her familiar, calm voice. "Mita," Harold began, a bit hesitantly, "can you bring me the personnel files of the employees who have been here for, say, over 10 years, just a selection to start with?" There was a brief pause on the other end. "Of course, Mr. Jones," she replied, though he could hear the faint surprise in her voice. This was not the sort of request Harold typically made. Normally, he focused exclusively on the executives, the decision-makers. He rarely paid attention to the employees who filled the ranks, those who formed the foundation of his company. As he waited for Nida, he checked his email, half distracted, as his thoughts continued to drift. He scanned the familiar demands from department heads, investor inquiries, budget requests, but for the first time, these tasks felt secondary. He realized he didn't know the faces behind these emails, the people whose efforts made his success possible. The thought unsettled him. All his life, he had prided himself on his authority, his control over his environment. But now he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been leading from a distance, managing numbers and outcomes rather than people. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Nida entered, holding a slim file of personnel records. She set them on his desk and gave him a curious glance. "Here are the files you requested, Mr. Jones," she said, her tone polite but tinged with curiosity. "Thank you, Nida," he replied, nodding in acknowledgement. She lingered a moment, as if considering saying something, but then seemed to think better of it and left. Harold opened the file, scanning the first few pages with a critical eye. The records were a mix of performance reviews, employment histories, and personal details. Each profile seemed to hint at a life story, struggles, successes, years of dedication. One name caught his eye: Margaret Ellis. She was a receptionist who had been with the company for nearly 15 years. Her file included glowing reviews, notes from managers about her reliability and kindness, and a few commendations for exceptional work. Harold vaguely remembered passing by her desk each day, but he'd never really acknowledged her, beyond perhaps a nod or a curt good morning. Turning to another profile, he saw the name Luis Ramirez, a maintenance worker. Luis had been with the company for 12 years, working the night shift, ensuring that the building remained spotless before the executives arrived each morning. There were notes of appreciation in his file from managers over the years, highlighting his meticulous work ethic and willingness to go above and beyond. Harold felt a pang of guilt. He had never considered the contributions of people like Louis and Margaret. They were the invisible threads that held the company together, people who quietly supported the grand structure he had built. Yet, he had never acknowledged them, barely even noticed them. A realization dawned on him. Perhaps Benjamin had been right. Maybe true respect wasn't something he could demand, but rather something he had to earn. Harold had always assumed that authority granted him respect automatically. But now, as he looked through the records, he understood that respect was something more profound, something that came from a leader's ability to connect, to recognize, and to appreciate those who worked for him. Harold was so engrossed in the files that he barely noticed the hours slip by. When he looked up, it was nearing noon. He closed the file slowly, a deep sense of introspection filling him. He knew he couldn't change overnight, but he felt a growing desire to do better, to be the kind of leader who inspired loyalty, not through fear, but through genuine respect. Summoning a burst of resolve, he decided to step out of his office and speak to some of the employees whose profiles he'd just reviewed. He wanted to start small, just a few conversations, maybe even a simple thank you. It was a step he had never considered taking before. He walked down the hallway, his eyes scanning the cubicles, looking for familiar faces. His first stop was at Margaret's desk. She looked up, surprised to see him standing there, and quickly straightened, smoothing her blouse as if preparing for some kind of reprimand. "Mr. Jones," she greeted him, her voice tinged with a mixture of nerves and respect. "Good afternoon, Margaret," Harold began, his voice softening as he realized how foreign this was for him. "I wanted to thank you for all you do here. I know you've been with us for a long time, and your dedication doesn't go unnoticed." Margaret's eyes widened, clearly taken aback. She glanced around, as if checking to see if this was some sort of test or joke, but his sincerity seemed to ease her initial skepticism. "Thank you, Mr. Jones," she replied, her voice warm with gratitude. "I appreciate that." As Harold moved away from her desk, he felt an odd sense of accomplishment, something different from the usual satisfaction he felt after landing a big deal or closing a major project. This was quieter, more personal, and it stirred something within him. He continued his walk, stopping briefly at various desks, engaging in short conversations, offering thanks or compliments, something small but genuine. The reactions were mixed. Some employees looked shocked, others smiled with warmth, while a few seemed wary, as if unsure what had prompted this sudden change. But as he moved through the office, he sensed the atmosphere shifting, softening. The tension he often carried with him seemed to dissipate, replaced by a tentative warmth, a newfound respect that felt more real than the fear he previously commanded. After a while, Harold found himself standing in front of the janitor's closet. Benjamin's cart was parked outside, a testament to the man's steady work ethic. The door was slightly ajar, and Harold could see Benjamin inside, organizing cleaning supplies, humming a soft tune. "Benjamin," Harold called softly. Benjamin turned, his calm gaze meeting Harold's. "Mr. Jones," he greeted him, nodding with a small smile. Harold began, suddenly feeling awkward. "I wanted to thank you." Benjamin raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Thank me? For what?" For being here. For showing up every day, and for the years you've dedicated to this place. I didn't realize, but you've been here longer than most of us. I think I've taken it for granted." Benjamin smiled, A quiet, knowing expression that held none of the surprise or skepticism Harold had seen from the other employees. It was as if he had expected this, as if he'd known all along that Harold had this realization within him, waiting to be uncovered. "I appreciate that, Mr. Jones," he said, his voice gentle. "But respect, like I said, is something you build. You're taking steps in the right direction, and that's a good start." Harold nodded, feeling a strange mix of humility and gratitude. He had spent years pushing people away, keeping them at a distance, thinking that his authority required separation. But here was Benjamin, a man with no title or status, reminding him of the power of connection, the strength in humility. For the first time in his career, Harold felt the true weight of leadership, not as a burden of control, but as a responsibility to uplift and recognize those around him. Do you think it's too late to change?" Harold asked, almost whispering, the vulnerability in his voice catching even him off guard. Benjamin shook his head, his smile gentle and reassuring. "It's never too late, Mr. Jones. Change doesn't happen overnight, but the journey starts with a single step. And from what I can see, you've already taken it." Harold nodded, the words settling in his mind, a quiet assurance that soothed the doubts lingering in his heart. He had always believed that strength lay in power and control, but Benjamin's quiet wisdom had shown him another path, one that required patience, humility, and the willingness to truly see those around him. As he walked back to his office, Harold felt lighter, a sense of peace washing over him. It was the beginning of something new, a journey that would undoubtedly be difficult, but one that he felt ready to embrace. For the first time, he saw himself not just as a CEO, but as a leader, a man striving not just for success, but for a legacy built on respect, kindness, and genuine human connection. Seeds of change. As the days passed, Harold felt the changes taking root in his daily routine. He made a conscious effort to greet employees by name, to listen rather than demand, to notice the small contributions that kept the company running smoothly. The shift in his behavior was subtle at first, almost tentative, as he tested the waters of this new approach to leadership. He wasn't certain how his employees would respond, if they would trust this softer side of him or see it as a facade. One morning, as Harold entered the office, he noticed Luis Ramirez, the night shift maintenance worker, still there, checking a faulty light fixture near the lobby. Luis looked up, surprised, when he saw Harold approaching. "Good morning, Luis," Harold greeted, smiling. He didn't hurry past this time. Instead, he stopped, taking a moment to appreciate the meticulous attention Luis paid to his work. Luis blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Morning, Mr. Jones," he replied, hesitantly. "I wanted to thank you," Harold said, his voice carrying the sincerity he had learned from Benjamin. "I know your shift is usually over by now, but it looks like you've stayed late to make sure everything is in order. That kind of dedication doesn't go unnoticed." Lewis's eyes widened, and for a moment, Harold saw a flicker of emotion, surprise mixed with pride. "Thank you, Mr. Jones. I like to make sure everything's working right. Don't want anyone's day to start off with a broken light or a mess." Harold nodded. "And that makes a big difference, Luis. You keep things running smoothly, and I appreciate it." As he walked away, Harold felt a sense of satisfaction that was different from his usual victories. It was quieter, more personal, and he sensed it was the kind of satisfaction that would stay with him. The brief exchange had been a small act, but it felt important. Luis was no longer an invisible part of the company's machinery. He was an individual whose contributions mattered. These moments began to accumulate, forming a new rhythm in Harold's life. He found himself paying more attention to the office environment, noticing details he'd once overlooked. The warmth of a shared laugh between colleagues, the relief on an intern's face when a manager offered help rather than criticism, the way employees worked harder and more willingly when they felt seen and valued. One day, a week after his conversation with Benjamin, Harold received a call from Nida. "Mr. Jones," she said, her voice careful, "I thought you should know that several employees have asked about you recently. They've noticed the changes in, well, your approach. They're curious, and a few have even said they appreciate it." Harold felt a mixture of pride and humility. "Thank you for telling me, Nida. I didn't realize it would make such a difference so soon." She hesitated, as though choosing her words carefully. "People notice more than you think, Mr. Jones. They've always respected you for your success, but now they're beginning to trust you. That's something that takes time, but you're on the right path." "Trust," he repeated softly, almost to himself. It was a word that hadn't crossed his mind often, not in the context of leadership. But he realized now that trust was a crucial foundation for any strong organization. If his employees trusted him, they would follow him willingly, not because they feared his authority, but because they believed in his vision. After the call with Nida, Harold sat back in his chair, staring out the window at the cityscape. The towering buildings no longer symbolized power to him. They felt more like a vast, intricate web of human stories, all interconnected. He realized that his company was much the same, a network of people, each with their own struggles and triumphs. Each person mattered, and each had a story worth knowing. With this thought in mind, Harold decided to organize a small gathering for his team, a chance for everyone to connect on a more personal level. He planned it as a simple afternoon coffee break, but with a twist. He'd join them, not as their boss, but as a fellow colleague. He didn't want it to be a formal meeting or a performance review. He wanted to show his employees that he valued them as people, not just as workers. The day of the gathering arrived, and Harold felt a rare flutter of nerves as he walked into the break room. Several employees were already there, chatting quietly. When they noticed him, their conversations hushed, and they exchanged surprised glances. "Good afternoon, everyone," Harold greeted, smiling. "I just wanted to take a few minutes to thank each of you for the work you do here. I know I don't always say it, but your efforts make this company what it is. We wouldn't be where we are without each of you." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, and a few employees exchanged smiles. Harold felt a warm sense of relief, sensing that his words were resonating. "And I thought it would be nice to get to know each other a little better," he continued. "Sometimes we get so focused on the work that we forget we're all here together, sharing this space every day. So let's take a few minutes just to talk, to share a bit about ourselves, whatever you feel comfortable with." The room fell quiet for a moment before Nida stepped forward, breaking the silence. "I'll start," she said, smiling at Harold before turning to the others. "I've been here for 10 years now, and I actually started as a receptionist. Over the years, I've worked my way up, and I feel lucky to be part of a team that has supported my growth." One by one, others began to share. Some talked about their families, others shared hobbies or personal anecdotes. Harold listened intently, taking in each story with genuine interest. As the gathering continued, laughter filled the room, and Harold found himself laughing too, feeling a closeness he hadn't felt before. He saw faces light up, barriers dissolve, and a sense of camaraderie take root. Eventually, Benjamin spoke up, his calm voice carrying a depth that drew everyone's attention. "I've been here for 20 years, seen a lot of faces come and go," he began, looking around the room. "And I can honestly say, this is the first time I've seen a moment like this, where everyone's just connecting. I think it's important, remembering that we're all more than just our roles here. So thank you, Mr. Jones, for making this happen." Harold nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He hadn't anticipated how much it would mean to him to hear those words from Benjamin, a man he had once dismissed as inconsequential. But now, he understood the depth of Benjamin's wisdom, the strength in his humility. The gathering wound down after a while, and people returned to their desks with lighter hearts, a bit more pep in their step. Harold lingered in the break room, watching them go, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He hadn't just learned to be a better leader, He'd rediscovered a part of himself he'd buried beneath ambition and pride. Later that day, as he was wrapping up work, Harold received a call from one of the investors. It was the same woman who had questioned him about the company's culture during the last meeting. "Mr. Jones," she began, her tone professional but warm, "I've heard some encouraging things about the changes you've been making at your company. There's a sense of cohesion developing that wasn't there before. I just wanted to let you know that we're taking notice." Harold felt a surge of pride, tempered by humility. "Thank you," he replied. "It's a work in progress, but I'm committed to building a company that's as strong on the inside as it appears on the outside." "I'm glad to hear that," she replied. "Because, as you know, true success doesn't just lie in profit margins. It's also in the loyalty and trust of those who work for you. We'll be watching with interest." As he ended the call, Harold sat back, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. He no longer felt that gnawing sense of isolation or fear that his authority would slip if he softened. Instead, he felt fortified, more certain in his position, and surprisingly at ease. He knew he still had a long way to go, but he was on a path that felt authentic, one where he could inspire loyalty, not through intimidation, but through genuine connection. When Harold finally left the office that evening, he noticed Benjamin cleaning in the lobby, his mop moving in steady, unhurried strokes. Harold walked over, nodding as Benjamin looked up. "Good night, Benjamin," Harold said, his voice warm. "Good night, Mr. Jones," Benjamin replied, nodding with a knowing smile. As Harold walked out into the crisp evening air, he felt a peace he hadn't known before. The city lights sparkled around him, a testament to human achievement, but also to the individuals behind each glimmer. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something larger than himself, not just a leader but a part of a community he respected and cherished. And with that realization, he knew he was finally becoming the man he'd always aspired to be, not just a successful CEO, but a respected leader, and perhaps in time, a better human being. A legacy of respect. Months passed, and the subtle transformations Harold had introduced took root and blossomed, spreading throughout the company like the branches of a well-tended tree. Employees seemed more at ease, sharing ideas freely and supporting one another without the tension that had once plagued the office. Harold's once distant relationship with his team had transformed into a dynamic of mutual respect and trust, a shift that surprised him as much as it did the people around him. The company's culture was beginning to change in ways that weren't just cosmetic. Productivity had increased, but not because of fear or pressure. Rather, people seemed genuinely invested in their work, motivated by a sense of belonging. Harold realized that for the first time, his employees were showing up not just to complete their tasks, but because they believed in the company's vision. And to his quiet pride, because they believed in him. One afternoon, Nida approached Harold with an envelope in hand, her expression both pleased and a bit nervous. "Mr. Jones," she began, holding out the envelope. "I wanted to share this with you. It's from some of the employees. They wrote letters expressing their appreciation for the changes you've made." Harold blinked, genuinely surprised. "Letters? For me?" She smiled. "Yes, it seems you've made quite an impression." Harold took the envelope, feeling an unexpected wave of emotion. He waited until he was alone in his office to open it, taking a deep breath before he slid out the stack of handwritten notes. Each letter was personal, filled with stories of how the employees had felt seen, respected, and valued under his leadership. They shared anecdotes of small moments where he had stopped to acknowledge their work, how his words of encouragement had meant more than he could have imagined. One note stood out from the others. It was from Wilson, the young intern he had once scolded so harshly. In the letter, Wilson shared how that moment had initially made him feel embarrassed and inadequate. But he then described how, in the months following, Harold's unexpected kindness and mentorship had transformed his experience at the company. Wilson wrote about how he now felt confident, excited to grow and learn, and he thanked Harold for showing him that even a powerful leader could be kind and humble. Harold's throat tightened as he read Wilson's words. He'd had no idea of the impact he was making. He'd simply been following his own journey of change, trying to become a better person. But to know that his actions were affecting people so deeply, that was a reward he hadn't anticipated. Folding the letters carefully, Harold placed them in his desk drawer, knowing they would be something he'd return to in times of doubt. They reminded him that leadership was as much about legacy as it was about strategy and profit. A true leader, he realized, didn't just build a company. They built a culture, a community, a sense of belonging that outlived any one individual. In the following weeks, Harold began to explore new ways to support his employees. He implemented an open-door policy, encouraging people to speak freely, knowing they could come to him with ideas, concerns, and even personal issues. He launched a mentorship program that paired newer employees with experienced team members. It wasn't long before he saw remarkable changes. Interns like Wilson flourished under the guidance of senior employees, while veterans like Margaret found renewed purpose in helping others. One afternoon, as Harold was going over the quarterly performance reports, he received an unexpected email from the board of directors. It was an invitation to a special meeting, set for the following week. The email was vague, providing no details beyond the time and date, but Harold felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. He knew the company's profits were stable, even growing slightly, but he also sensed that the board might have noticed the cultural shift that had taken place. When the day of the meeting arrived, Harold found himself sitting before the board, a mix of familiar faces and new ones. The senior investor who had previously questioned him about the company's culture sat directly across from him, her sharp gaze both reassuring and probing. "Mr. Jones," she began, her tone professional but warmer than before. "We've been monitoring the changes you've implemented in the company over the past few months. We've spoken to employees at various levels, and the feedback we've received has been overwhelmingly positive." Harold nodded, unsure of where this was leading. "We've seen companies rise and fall based on how they treat their people," she continued. "Your decision to prioritize respect, trust, and mentorship within the company is one we rarely see, especially at your level of leadership. It's refreshing, and it's something we believe aligns with the long-term vision we have for this organization." The other board members nodded, their expressions reflecting genuine approval. "In light of these positive changes, we'd like to propose a new initiative," she said. "We want you to lead a cultural transformation program, not just within this company, but as part of a larger initiative to set a new standard in corporate culture. You would be consulting with other companies, sharing your experience, and helping redefine what effective leadership looks like." Harold was stunned. The idea of stepping into a role that extended beyond his own company, guiding others in leadership, was something he'd never imagined. He felt a rush of gratitude, mixed with a sense of responsibility. This was not only an opportunity to grow, but a chance to contribute to a lasting legacy. A legacy not built on numbers and profits, but on human values. I would be honored," he finally replied, his voice filled with emotion he didn't try to hide. As the meeting concluded, Harold felt a sense of purpose unlike anything he'd experienced before. He realized that his transformation had come full circle. He had started this journey searching for control and authority, but he had found something far more valuable: the understanding that true leadership was about empowering others, about giving people a sense of worth and purpose. On his way back to his office, Harold passed by Benjamin, who was cleaning the glass doors of the lobby. He paused, watching Benjamin work, and then approached him, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. "Benjamin," Harold began, his voice soft but filled with sincerity, "I don't think I've ever properly thanked you. You've been more than just an employee here. You've been a mentor, a guide. I don't think I'd be where I am without your words that day." Benjamin looked up, a gentle smile spreading across his face. "You did the work, Mr. Jones. All I did was remind you of what you already knew, deep down." Harold shook his head, his expression earnest. "No, Benjamin, you did more than that. You showed me what it means to lead with heart. I've spent so many years focused on numbers, strategies, and profit that I forgot the importance of kindness, humility, and respect. I see it now, and it's because of you." Benjamin chuckled, nodding thoughtfully. "It's never too late to make a change, Mr. Jones, and you've done well. I'm proud to work here and to see the difference you're making." Harold extended his hand, and Benjamin took it, their handshake a symbol of the mutual respect and friendship that had grown between them. It was a moment Harold knew he would carry with him, a reminder of the values he now held dear. Over the next year, Harold embarked on the initiative set forth by the board. He traveled to various companies, meeting with executives, HR teams, and employees, sharing his journey and advocating for a culture built on respect, empathy, and genuine human connection. He spoke candidly about his own mistakes, his early arrogance, and the pivotal role that people like Benjamin had played in shaping his perspective. He found that his story resonated deeply, inspiring others to reevaluate their approach to leadership. Back at his own company, the changes he had implemented continued to grow, strengthening the bonds among employees and creating an atmosphere of loyalty and trust. Interns like Wilson went on to become managers, carrying forward the values they had learned under Harold's guidance. Veterans like Margaret and Louis found themselves reinvigorated, grateful to be part of a company that valued not only their work, but also their well-being. Years later, as Harold prepared for his eventual retirement, he took one last walk through the office, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The young intern he had once scolded was now a confident manager. Nida had moved into an executive role, overseeing operations with the same calm professionalism she'd shown as his assistant. Margaret had become the head of HR, fostering a culture that prioritized mentorship and support. Even Benjamin, who continued to work in the building, had become a beloved figure, a symbol of the humility and wisdom that had transformed Harold's life. As he prepared to leave his office for the last time, Harold felt a deep sense of peace. He hadn't just built a successful company. He had created a legacy of respect, kindness, and compassion. He knew that, in the end, people wouldn't remember him for his profits or his power. They would remember him for the lives he had touched, for the dignity he had restored to the workplace, and for the respect he had earned, not demanded. In the lobby, as he exited the building, Harold saw Benjamin one final time, still going about his work with that familiar steady calm. "Goodbye, Benjamin," Harold said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for everything." Benjamin nodded, his eyes twinkling with warmth. "Goodbye, Mr. Jones. Remember, the real work never ends. We're always learning, always growing." Harold smiled, nodding. As he stepped out into the world beyond, he knew he would carry Benjamin's words with him forever.